It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Mekel Haris today. Dr. Mekel Haris, a licensed psychologist and health service provider, currently serves in private practice, offering psychological evaluation and support on an individual basis. Further, she offers training, education, consultative, and supervisory services to organizations throughout the country. Pre- and postdoctorally trained at the Children's Hospital, Los Angeles, Mekel specializes in coping and adjustment to acute and chronic illness, grief and loss, and health-related trauma. She holds an advanced certification in advanced perinatal mental health through Postpartum Support International. Throughout the past decade, Mekel has presented at over 30 domestic and international conferences focused on pediatric, family, and community health issues, including grief and loss. She is a TEDx speaker, blogger, magazine and podcast contributor, and author of a memoir, Relaxing into the Pain, My Journey into Grief and Beyond. In addition, Dr. Haris is the creator of the mini course and ebook, The Grief Anatomy Toolkit, and Reimagining Life After Loss interactive course. In her spare time, she enjoys writing, traveling around the globe, and spending time with family, friends, and her feisty beagle. Mekel's faith and relationships, coupled with real life challenges, keep her tethered to what matters most in life. And I'm so excited that she's going to talk to us today. And I will give it away to her now. Please unmute yourself when you're ready.
Hello, hello. Good afternoon to you and late morning to some of you. I'm so thrilled. Kelly, I just want to say thank you for coordinating all of this, for giving of your time and basically helping me show up where I needed to be today. It's such an honor to be part of the She Recovers Foundation Mental Health Monday. And I just have a question. Isn't it a great day to talk about mental health? Yes. Yeah, so let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. And while I'm doing that, I want to, again, just welcome all of you. If you don't mind typing in this chat that you can see this, that would be awesome. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, give me a thumbs up and then I'll get started. All right, thank you. Okay, so today we're going to talk about something that you may have been thinking when you registered, what in the world is this? How in the world is this lady going to come talk about leaning into grief as self-care? All right, well, let me give a caveat. I know that the thought of this may feel daunting, but what I hope to do today is to make a case for why leaning into those parts of our stories that are uncomfortable, that may provoke emotion, and that may overwhelm us even is critical to the self-care process. But before I do that, I want us to take about 30 seconds to just ground ourselves. For a lot of you, including myself, you may have had a busy morning, and this may be the first time that you're actually sitting down to be still. And I want to honor that, right? Part of leaning into grief requires stillness. And I know that can sometimes be a little scary and overwhelming, but I want to invite you into about 30 seconds of stillness. So if you are seated and not driving, I want you to place your feet on the ground, uncross your arms, and just sit back into your chair, right? Lean back and know that in this moment and over the next few moments that you are going to be supported, that you are being held, and that you are safe. So with the 30 seconds, I want us to simply close your eyes if you feel comfortable doing that. If not, that's completely fine. I'm going to close my eyes for a moment and just focus on my breath, focus on the here and now, just with a simple inhalation and a nice exhalation, truly appreciating that we have the joy of the present moment. For a lot of us, as we think about those things that have created grief and loss, with that comes a lot of emotion, and that's completely understandable. I want you in this moment to simply breathe in those things that haven't necessarily served you, and just with the exhale, let that go and know that we are here now, again, that we're safe and that you are seen. Okay. All right, so thank you for that. You can open up your eyes. I hope that felt refreshing just to be able to sit in stillness for a moment. Before I get into the nuts and bolts of our conversation today, I want to offer some gentle reminders, some things for us to be mindful of over the next few moments. And that is what's said here via the chat stays here, right? We know that this is live streaming and there's some openness to the space. However, I do want to honor that if you choose to type something in the chat box, if you choose to involve yourself in the questioning or the responses to things, please respect the fact that we are a little bubble over the next hour, and let's be mindful of that. Any emotions that may arise throughout the next few moments are completely welcome. And I challenge you that if something does sort of rise up within you, whatever that may be, take those steps to care for yourself. Sometimes talking about grief and loss is enough to sort of create a bit of a tidal wave. So do what's necessary to honor your process and take care of yourself. One of the things I've loved about these virtual spaces is it's a beautiful visual reminder that none of us is alone, right? Sometimes when we're sitting in our computer and we're looking at a screen, or just in our private moments, we think, nobody else gets this. No one else has journeyed through this process. And while our journeys are not the same, there are similar threads enough to remind us that we are bonded with some universal things. And one of those is grief and loss. So you are not alone. Also, to remember that each person's process, yours, mine, the person on the other side of the screen from around the world, each of our processes is unique, and that's neither good or bad, right or wrong. It just is. So for today, I just want to remind you to honor your process wherever you are along the grief and loss journey. So if you're like me, you like a roadmap. When I get in the car, I can't even go to the grocery store hardly these days without putting on my GPS. I like to know where I'm going. So this is where we're going over the next few moments. I'm going to start off with a definition of what grief is, just to sort of ground us and anchor us in the conversation. And then we're going to talk about some common responses to grief. Some of these you may know and have experienced, some may be newer to you. Then I'll pivot a little bit and talk about why there is a huge tendency among all of us in this society to avoid grief, right? I want to normalize that. But as I mentioned before, I want to make this case for grief as an act of self-care by providing some data, showing some statistics, and helping to drive us in that direction. And then I'll get down to what it is that you really want to know, probably. And that is some tools and practices for doing just that. How do we engage what things are within us and those things around us to actually dive into grief as self-care? And as Kelly mentioned, there'll be an opportunity for Q&A and some discussion, if you will, at the end. If you're like me during presentations, questions come up and they're gone within a few seconds. So it's okay if you have a question throughout, just type it in the chat box. Kelly and our co-hosts are observing that chat box in the Q&A box, and we'll come back to that towards the end. So again, thank you all for giving me the opportunity to share some time with you today. All right, so let's start off with a basic definition of grief, right? We tend to think of grief in society, or sometimes we don't even think about grief in society, but I want to say right off the bat that grief is a natural and normal response to a death or loss. And when I say death, I'm not just talking about a physical death of a person. While yes, that certainly can provoke grief. But if we even think about the past couple of years with regard to the pandemic, each of us has experienced deaths, whether that be the death of expectations for this season of our lives, or the death of dreams and hopes that we wanted to accomplish at this time, or even the death or loss of our identities. So helping to sort of make sense of who we are in the midst of a season where we thought things may look differently. But grief is a natural and normal response. It's actually a universal theme, and it's something that we will all go through no matter our background, our socioeconomic status, our race or ethnic origin, or anything, we're going to go through grief. So I want to set that tone right off the bat, that if you're experiencing grief symptoms, welcome to humanity. You are 100% normal. Now, I put the second bullet here that grief is the internalized feelings associated with the pain of loss. So often we sort of confuse grief from mourning, right? You've heard of mourning, Mourning. And mourning is really the external expression of grief. These are the tears that you may see. These are the rituals that we engage in on the outside, including funerals or memorialization services of some sort. But grief is internal. And this is what makes grief really, really tricky, both for the person who's grieving and for the person who's supporting the grieving person, because it's invisible, right? When I look at you or you look at me, you may be thinking, okay, she's smiling, she's showing up, she's doing all these things that she normally does, so she's just fine. And this is what makes it complicated with grief. You may be a person walking through grief and not necessarily getting the support from other people around you. And sometimes it's because others are looking at you, they're looking at me at a surface level. They can't see the invisible nature of grief. And so it's really important that we remember that it's internalized. Later on, when we get into the tools and practices, I want to spend some time talking about some ways to externalize our grief. How can we take those things that are internal and make them visible, largely for ourselves, but also and equally as important to the people around us? So that's sort of an overarching nature of grief here. Now, you probably already know some of these responses to grief, especially the second bullet point. Like when we think about grief, we often think about sadness. And absolutely, when we think about things that we have lost, experiences that we've walked through, traumas that have resulted in loss or are overlaid with loss, we can definitely experience sadness. But we don't often think about anger and irritability. In a moment, I want to share a personal story to help highlight the fact that anger, again, an invisible thing, but that can sometimes manifest on the outside. Sometimes the root of that is grief. And so this is a response that we don't often think of, but that it's important to be mindful of as we navigate the process. Also, guilt, right? So when we experience loss, there may be guilt associated with conversations that weren't had, or guilt about the way something ended, or guilt around the expression of grief itself, or the feelings associated with grief. Guilt often comes up a lot. And as I sit with clients one-on-one, guilt and shame tend to sort of coalesce, right? And this shows up in the form of unanswered questions or feeling as if something could have been done differently that would have resulted in a different ending. So guilt is always something to be mindful of. Along the same lines, sometimes people feel resentment towards the person, if it's a physical death, or resentment within themselves about a response that they did or didn't have. So feelings of resentment or self-resentment can certainly manifest. And when you think about sort of the complexities of grief, if you look at this picture here, we see this volcano, right? Again, on the outside looking in, this volcano looks really normal. It looks like a typical mountain, nothing's going on. But internally, because of the weight of grief, and we know if you're walking the grief journey, that grief is very weighty. Sometimes that can make us feel not only helpless, but it can also make us feel hopeless, and it's invisible. So the hopelessness can manifest in exhaustion, fatigue, a feeling of paralysis, not knowing what to do or where to go or how to find the support that we need. And that can create a lot of internal turmoil and sometimes lead to feelings of depression and or anxiety. So our next point here is fear and anxiety. So I want to stop for just a second and talk about this. when we think about grief, right, it's a natural and normal response to loss. Often this happens in the form of a sudden change in life. And even if we anticipated the loss, it still feels sudden when our life pivots in a new direction that we were hoping that it did. And with that sort of comes this rug being pulled out from under us. And that can cause us to question a lot of things like, do I really feel safe? Do I really feel secure? Is the world around me as orderly as I thought it was? And so we're faced with these questions and these realities of maybe things aren't as nicely put together as I thought they were. That can create a scenario where we start to feel fearful and we start to feel doubt relatedly about who we can trust, whether we can really feel certain, whether we can really lean into other people as support persons. So if you are experiencing any of these things, again, you are 100% normal. And I do want to add that it's not typical that we feel one emotion at one time. So you may be experiencing an array of grief responses, and that is perfectly normal. Okay, so I wanted to capture this in the form of a ball of yarn, right? I'll share a story in just a moment about my first significant experience with a loss. But I went into the grief process thinking, okay, here I am on the left. Let me just sort of dole out this one thread of yarn and I'll make sense of it sort of thread by thread. And what I realized 1.2 seconds into the grief process was, whoa, there is a huge complexity of emotions, of transitions, of how I feel about myself, how I relate to other people. And it was so much jumbled things going on. And part of the process, right, of leaning into grief as self-care is acknowledging this ball of yarn. It's acknowledging that, yes, this is complex. And it doesn't mean that anything's wrong with you. If anything, it means that everything's right with you, that grief is complex and the way that you navigate it is complex and ever changing. So if you don't leave with anything else today, think about this ball of yarn. And if you feel the overwhelming complexities of grief today and in the days to come, just think, this just means I'm human, right? This just means that I am perfectly okay and I'm acknowledging exactly how I feel. So I want to share a little story. This is me on the right. I was a little bit cheekier then, but this is me with my beautiful mom, Patricia Ann Harris. And this was a picture taken in about 2007, Thanksgiving Day. And you can see that we were arm in arm. Love my mom. I think I look a lot like her, even though a lot of people think I look like my dad. But when I see this picture, which is my favorite one of the two of us, it is just pure love. Well, my mom, who was a nurse and a nursing professor, knew her body really well, right? I grew up listening to, you're not taking any days off of school, right? You're going to muscle your way through this. She was also an Air Force veteran. And my dad was too. So I grew up in a household of, you're going to get through this, right? You're not taking any days off. If an Aleve or an Advil won't cover it, then maybe we'll stay home, but we're definitely not going to the doctor because my mom was right there to tend to things. And my mom, the way that I describe her was not only as a mom, but she was also my confidant, my spiritual partner at the time. For many years, I was single. She was my boyfriend. She was everything wrapped into one. And at the beginning of 2012, one of the things I knew that had shifted about my mom was that she didn't want to talk on the phone. I was living in LA and she was in Texas. And I knew something was going on because she and I would have these marathon conversations. I don't know if any of you can identify with this, but we could stay on the phone for 24 hours, fall asleep, take a mini nap, get back up, and jump right into the conversation. But at the beginning of 2012, she started to sort of not want to talk on the phone as much. She started to notice that she was feeling more tired. And fast forward, this led to November 2012. I mentioned that my mom was a nurse. And so she didn't really go to the doctor readily because she knew her body and sort of trusted her own instincts. Well, she woke up and that particular day, she knew something was wrong. So she drove herself to the ER. Like that is so my mom. She drove herself to the ER and she gets there and they're like, your eyes are yellowing. She was experiencing jaundice. So they said, let's admit you and run some tests. Well, within 24 hours, they had done a special procedure and diagnosed her with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And from her diagnosis date until her death on December 9th, 2012 was 30 days. And so you can only imagine just the sheer magnitude of loss, of grief, of confusion, anger, instability, everything that you can think of. But my response to grief at that time was, you know what? We've got to get through it. Partly the way that I was trained and conditioned growing up. We've got to get through it. We've got to get back to normal as quickly as possible. And let's just sort of put this grief thing on the side. You may be sitting here today in that same place where you're thinking, yeah, I'm just going to tuck that away in the drawer and not really deal with that. Well, I should have known that wasn't going to work because in my 20s, that's what I did with bills. The bills would come. I didn't want my parents to know I was in credit card debt. I put it in the drawer and I thought, whew, no more bills until the phone calls started coming and coming and coming. And grief was very much the same. No matter how much I tried to outrun it, I just couldn't. And by the way, I was a track star back in the day, but I couldn't put on shoes great enough to outrun the weight of grief. So you may be wondering, why in the world is she sharing the story? Well, I told you that I was going to make a case for leaning into grief. Here's part of the data that I want to share. We all want to avoid grief, right? Grief is messy, it is complicated, and it's very overwhelming. And the thought of diving into something painful, we just don't want to do it. And that makes sense, right? But you probably heard one of these 3 phrases, right? And I'll share them. We can't heal what we don't reveal, right? In the recovery world, this is something that you may have already heard. If you don't address what's really right in front of you, it's hard to actually heal that or experience any sort of insight or recovery around it. Here's another way of putting this, that our secrets keep us sick. Well, I was moving on with my academic life. I was living in LA. I was really pretending that everything was completely fine. All the while, I was holding the secret of grief. And I didn't want everybody around me to know that I was in that much pain because I didn't want them to feel sorry for me. I didn't want them to change what they were doing. And I just didn't want to be identified as grief girl. However, that secret was keeping me really sick. And in just a minute, I'll share some of the ways that it was showing up. Another way of putting this is what's hidden often becomes magnified, right? We can't outrun grief. The more I tried to push grief away, the more that it became magnified in ways that were really difficult to ignore. So you may be sitting here today thinking, you know what? I don't want to deal with that. I'll just deal with the grief later. I'll focus on that later. Well, I'm here to tell you, and I want to challenge you to lean into the pain of grief gradually and carefully, and perhaps with support, but to know that what is hidden often becomes magnified. So I would ask, and do me a favor and type in the chat box or on Facebook, what comes to your mind when you think of self-care? What comes to mind? I will guess that leaning into grief is probably the last thing on your mind. But what comes to mind for you? For me, it was things like pedicures and manicures, traveling around the world. It was getting my hair done. It was maybe going to get a facial. And nothing is wrong with those sorts of self-care. They are important. And we can certainly think of moments where that helped us relieve some of the stress that we felt. But here's the thing about those sorts of self-care. They're temporary, right? I don't know if you're like me, but I've gone to get the pedicure and manicure many, many times since December 9th, 2012. And I do feel great for that hour. I love the kneading of the person massaging my feet and my legs and doing all those things. But at the end of it, grief is still there. And even though I've tucked it under the carpet for that hour, hour and a half, it still rises to the surface. And this is the case that I want to make for leaning into grief as self-care. So, what are some of the facts? Um, you may or may not know this, and it's always startling to me when I read this, that stress-related complaints and ailments account for 75 to 90% of primary care physician visits. 75 to 90% of primary care physician visits. Think about that. This means that the average person coming in to see their doctor, it's something stress related, it's something invisible. And this was definitely true for me. When my mom died, I found myself at the doctor's office over 20, 25 times between 2013 and 14. I was experiencing random physical aches and pains. On one occasion, I was getting out of my car. I had gone down to Venice Beach, tried to get out of the car, and for some reason, my left leg was just numb. It was numb. I literally had to pick up my thigh with my hands, drop my leg out to the outside of the car, and then all of a sudden feeling came back. And so of course I ran straight to the doctor, ran all these tests, only to be met with, Mekel, everything looks normal. Everything looks completely fine. I'd show back up with headaches and stomach upset and think, oh no, my mom was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It has to be something going on, only for them to say, Mekel, all your lab work is normal. They were these seemingly random things that were totally stress related. I also realized that I couldn't sleep. And this was related in part to the nature of my mom's death and where I was in proximity to her. But for a couple of years, my sleep was completely dysregulated. I was popping up in the middle of the night. I was exhausted during the day and I was irritable. Remember that anger that I mentioned? That was a huge symptom that I was experiencing. And on top of that, I kept losing weight. I couldn't keep anything on. And then it circled into weight gain. So these are the facts that if we don't address those things, if we try to outrun and avoid grief, sometimes, a lot of the times, it can manifest in our bodies. And we'll find ourselves at that PCP visit going, what the heck is wrong? Only for them to say, we can't find anything. Everything looks okay. Now, here's some other data. Okay, so here I am building up my case with you. Recent studies. So if we kind of go back to 2020, I'm sorry, 2002, we know in the research literature, right? Self-care is nothing new. This concept is nothing new. But even 20 years ago, almost, a lot of research was saying that we've got to shift self-care strategies to an awareness of our emotions, right? It can't just be external self-care. We've got to focus on these inward things that really help us anchor in what the problem really is, as opposed to only externalizing. That was in 2002. In 2012, another study was talking about the importance of setting goals and engaging in activity, meaning that self-care is an active process. Self-care that's passive, okay, can feel good in the moment, but it's temporary and it doesn't really get to the crux of what's going on. So we've got to schedule some activities. We've got to set some goals around how to really look at what is happening inwardly in order to heal. And then 2020, a most recent study, talked about the importance of inner and outer self-care. So it's nothing wrong with the outer forms of self-care. Those are important. But what's equally as important is that we're looking inwardly. And that is where leaning into grief comes in. So let me take a moment to sort of talk about how do we actually lean into grief. I want to share a really seemingly simple story here. And this was related to the experiences that I had at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. So I was a licensed psychologist, and I was called in a lot of the times to work with kids who were afraid of needles. They, of course, were like frightened thinking about going in for these medical procedures, and the doctors would be standing around with their white coats, and the kids would be screaming, and the parents would be crying. And it was this really dramatic scene. And so they would call me or page me. Well, yeah, when we had pagers, they would page me and say, "Hey, Dr. Harris, can you come over here and sort of help us deal with this? Because we've got to do this medical procedure for this child's care." So I would show up, and 99% of the time, after I made that eyeball contact with the kiddo, and with his parents or her parents' permission, would provide some gentle, touch just to let them know that I was safe. I would share the story of um, what would happen if you saw something coming towards you and you were stiff and tight and just, you just balled up full of fear. And inadvertently, the kids would always say, "Oh, yeah, that's going to make it a lot worse," right? If I'm sort of in this crunched up position, it's going to be way more painful than if I relax into or lean into the pain. And it was this perfect opening for me to say, "Yeah, that's right." And in much the same way, if we can lean into the pain of this needle stick, right? You're going to feel a little bit of pain, but I wonder if we were to take the approach of, as they're putting the needle in, we're letting things out. And you could almost see the wheels turning in these kids' head. They would say, "Oh yeah, that makes sense." And this, along with very similar strategies, would be the way for us to sort of be able to get them to take this needle stick and experience a little bit of pain, but way lesser pain than if they had sat there crunched up and balled up. This is the analogy that I want to use to help you. So, for some of you watching, you may have been avoiding grief for so long, yet you're wrestling inside. And you know that the pain of staying crunched up, balled up, internalized with your grief is way more painful. And so I want you, if you have a pen, to write this down. What would it look like if I relaxed into, if I leaned into the pain of grief? I would be crazy sitting here if I said, "You're not going to feel any pain." No, the truth is, grief is painful. The process of navigating it definitely is. Yet, if we look at this and sort of weigh the consequences of not addressing it versus addressing it every single time, addressing it is going to walk you down a path where the pain, while real, won't be anywhere near the magnified pain if you try to avoid it. So, here are three sort of key things that I want you to think about how to lean into the grief. The first thing we've got to do, and I'll talk about this in more detail in a minute, is name the feelings, right? So often we are in situations where we lie, right? I remember when my mom died and friends would ask, "Hey, Mekel, how are you?" "Oh, I'm fine, I'm good." And I had a smile on my face. And so again, from the outside looking in, they're thinking she has it all together. She's fine. But I was suffering inside. So one of the most challenging yet the most profound things that we can do as we lean into grief is name the feelings. We'll come back to that. We also need to explore our needs and desires, which often in the face of grief, there's so much going on. It's hard to even pinpoint what we need. So we'll talk about how to do that. And then third, we need to take steps to meet those needs, right? So again, grief processing is an active process. It's not a passive bystander. It's an active process that we have to lean into. So I'll share these slides with Kelly later on, and you're also welcome to reach back out to me. But when we're naming feelings, one of the ways that I have really found, it's not the only way, but one of the ways to really check in with yourself and take stock of how you're feeling is through writing. Now, some of you may be watching this going, "Oh, I hate writing. I hate journaling." Okay, I get that. And there's some workarounds that I'll talk about in just a second. But I really want you to think about the importance of checking in with yourself, whether through writing it down or even using the notes feature or the audio feature on your phone. Is to check in with yourself, right? If we don't name the feeling, it's going to be very difficult to ask for what we need or to search for what we need because we don't even know how we feel. All right, so here are some things, some prompts to help get you thinking about how you are feeling. So one of them is to ask yourself, what's coming to mind, parentheses, in this moment is, what's coming to mind for you? What may be coming to mind as you think about this tremendous loss you faced is fear. What may be coming to mind is anger or regret or resentment. Take stock of what it is. Right now, we're not doing anything with it necessarily. We just need to find out what it is to name that feeling. Secondly, we need to understand what's happening in our thoughts, right? So here's a prompt to help you get you thinking in that direction. My thoughts are taking me in the direction of, for right now, it may be avoidance. My thoughts are taking me into a direction of, I don't want to do this. Or my thoughts are taking me in the direction of ambivalence, lack of clarity, whatever it is, it's important to take stock. And then thirdly, we want to sort of get down to the nuts and bolts of this. In this season, in this moment, today, right now, I feel, and name whatever that is. I know that's a scary place to be, but it's such a critical place to be in order to get to the next point, which is to name and explore your needs and desires. So what I would love for you to do, even now, write those down for yourself. What's coming to mind is, my thoughts are taking me in the direction of, in this season, I feel, right? Here's a practical way that I do this every single day, right? Because I know that grief's overwhelming and I know I've still got to engage in day-to-day life, is I use my phone. I'll set my timer on my phone. It's like a little alarm twice a day. And the goal is simply when the alarm goes off, is to go through these three prompts in my mind. Some days I have a chance to write them down. Some days I just think about it. But why they're so valuable is because they give me information. If I know that what's coming to mind right now is fear, and my thoughts are taking me into avoidance, and in the season I feel fatigued, that lets me know, okay, here's some information that I can use to help me get the help that I need. So this is why it's important to take stock. Okay, so naming our feelings. Secondly, we want to explore our needs and desires. Okay, and this can happen through what I like to call WHH questions. All right, so first question, what soothes my body when I feel tension? Right? What soothes me, right? We're trying to sort of explore what we need. If I can identify what soothes me, then I can identify something I might need in the moment. And then thirdly, I can take steps to get there. What soothes my body? How do I calm my racing mind, right? How might I calm my racing mind? Who helps me feel safe and seen? That's really important, right? So often in the grief world, we'll talk about asking for help, seeking support. Here's the truth, and this is sort of a hard, dirty truth, and that is everyone around you may not be able to make you feel safe and seen, and that's okay. That's okay. The key is to figure out who helps you feel safe and seen. Again, giving you information, helping you identify what you need, and then taking the steps to meet that need. And then finally, where do I feel most calm, most safe, and most known? That may be your bed. That may be your car. For me, it's the car. I feel the most calm in my car. Don't ask me why. Maybe it's a product of being part of a military family, but I go to my car when I feel completely overwhelmed, and I feel that cocoon. I feel the safety of my car. I can scream in there. I can cry in there. I can shout, whatever I want to do. That's where I feel. So it's important to know what your needs are. And then thirdly, we're going to ask ourselves some questions to figure out how to take those steps. Okay, so again, these are just some questions to get you thinking. All right, so I want to acknowledge right off the bat that taking steps to meet our needs involves risk. And as a grieving heart myself, I know that some days I don't necessarily want to take that risk because of fear and because of overwhelm, or maybe I've taken the risk before and that need wasn't met. But I want to challenge you, right? you are walking through, you have walked through, right? A season of life that has already been difficult. You've already taken risks. You've already seen that as you take risks, that you're met with people who can hold you, who can support you. You've seen your own internal capacities. So as scary as it may feel to take the risk, I want to challenge you to do it anyway, because you're worth it. And your self-care is absolutely worth it. All right, so here's some things that we can do to take those steps to meet our needs. Number one, honestly, the one that I dread the most, but that I force myself to do the most, and that is asking for help. Okay, you may be thinking, all right, Mekel, I don't want to burden people. People have their own things going on. We're all struggling with something. I don't want to do that. Well, I get that. And the truth is, other people do have things going on, but leave it to the person who you're seeking help from to tell you, Mekel, that's way too much. Don't you assume that a person can't carry what it is that you're asking them to carry. Leave it to them to tell you. And if they don't tell you that, continue to lean in and know that not only are you offering them probably a huge gift by being able to support you, but you're offering yourself the gift of risk, of vulnerability, and support. And that is so critical throughout the grief process. We are not wired to do things and live life alone. So asking for help is important. You can also connect with like-minded people, right? So I remember the first time that I sat down at a grief and loss support group, and I thought, man, I am not like these people. I don't want to be in this group. I don't want to be part of this club. And you may be feeling that way too. At the same time, as friends encouraged me, literally pushed me through the doors of the support group, I started to feel like, wow, this is such a relief. I don't have to pretend. I don't have to say I'm fine. I don't have to lie anymore because I'm around people who actually understand and get it without me having to even speak. So there is power in connecting with people. And I know through She Recovers that you're probably already connected with this like-minded community. And that is so critical. And then last here, how can we take care of our needs? Well, we've got to extend grace towards ourselves, right? We've got to be compassionate with ourselves. This is also hard for a lot of us because we love beating ourselves up. So if this is you, perhaps this becomes the most important thing that you focus on from here on out is extending self-compassion. Saying a personal statement to yourself, I forgive myself for, and then following that quickly up with, I am proud of, and filling in that gap. I forgive myself for what I'm most proud of is, right? And avoiding comparison to other people. So I mentioned earlier on, your experience of grief, your experience of trauma and grief is unique. It's not right. It's not wrong. It's not good or bad. It just is. And to the extent that we can sort of look at our own experience, challenge ourselves to address what we need, and then take steps to meet that, we're honoring our grief, right? We're not comparing it because there is no comparison. We are honoring the essence of who we are. So naming our feelings, exploring our needs and desires, and then taking steps to meet those needs are the three critical ways to lean into grief. All right, so I want to wrap things up so we have some time for Q&A. Number one, grief is a normal and natural response to loss. If you're walking with that and you're feeling bad about feeling or having a reaction, I hope that today you're able to let that go, let that thought go, because it's normal and you are human as you grieve, just as you love. That's also normal and natural. Avoiding grief isn't an option. It's no longer an option, right? I hope that you choose the path of leaning into grief as opposed to thinking that you can outrun it, because it's just not possible. We've got to take steps to identify what's really going on. And then finally, taking those steps to lean into grief is critical. It's not only critical for you, but I want you to think about you within the context of your family, within the context of your community, and so forth. As you lean into grief, you are benefiting your loved ones, you are benefiting your extended family, and you're benefiting your community. And I'll even take a step farther. You are impacting generations, right? As generational trauma and grief can persist, so can generational healing, so can generational prosperity. So I want to encourage you to lean into this, knowing that it's going to ripple effect way beyond you. So I want to conclude here with a very profound quote. And when I first read this quote a decade ago, I didn't agree with it. Let me throw that out there, right? Audre Lorde said that caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. When I first read this, I thought, come on, Audra, that's a little melodramatic, an act of political warfare. But as time has gone on, as I've navigated this grief journey for almost a decade at this point, I realized that self-care is not self-indulgent. It is about preserving the essence of who I am, remembering that I'm worth that preservation. And it is a battle. It's an act of political warfare. The extent to which I do it is not just about me. So I have to do it. So what I hope today is that I have made a strong case for leaning into grief as self-care. And with that, I want to create some time for questions and answers. So Kelly, please chime back on and let me know what we have. Thank you.
So wonderful. Thank you so much. This was so amazing. Let me get myself up there spotlighted with you. If you can stop sharing your screen for a second, I think that might help.
Absolutely.
There we go. Add spotlight. Yay. Awesome. Oh my gosh. So poignant. I needed this as much as anyone, for anyone out there who's feeling grief, because I am. And I didn't have those questions to ask myself. So I'm so thankful that you shared them with us. And I know it's going to help so many people. Yeah. So let's get straight to the questions. The first one is, I am in the health and wellness field, and I noticed that many conditions, including grief, are confined to very specific situations. I realized I was in recovery from grief. I have been grieving the loss of my religion, of my upbringing. I have been grieving the younger me who was raped. I have been grieving to lack of support I have received, and grieving so much of who I thought I was. How do we as a community and people in health and wellness expand the understanding of grief, allowing others to feel seen?
That's so good. Oh, I love this question. So doing just this, right? What I always sort of lead with when I answer this sort of question is grief isn't sexy, right? Right. But it's the sexiest thing that we can talk about, because it's the one thing in life we are all going to face. We're not all going to buy a home. We're not all going to travel. We're not all going to have children or get married, but we're all going to experience loss. And so I think that one of the ways to sort of elevate this conversation is by doing just that. When you recognize, whether in the healthcare setting or in your personal sphere, that grief is amongst you, name the elephant. Name the elephant, because probably you naming it is going to free somebody else, because they're thinking, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. And when someone finally takes the risk and has the courage to name it, it's almost as if, and I've done this, it's almost like you have a collective exhale, like, finally, I'm not the only one. Right. So name it in your communities and do your best when you see it to shine a light on what's really before you.
For sure. I think that's so important, especially in today's world when we're experiencing so much grief from so many different situations. As this person said, it's not just about the loss of a person. Of course, that's devastating, but it's also the loss of a career, the loss of the person you were before a loss, the loss of, whatever transition in life it may be. So it's so important that we all talk about it.
Absolutely.
And with that, this is a similar question in that same vein. Often grief makes people feel uncomfortable, and they may say all the wrong things. What's your advice when trying to share our grief in a society that makes people feel uncomfortable about grief?
Yes. Oh my goodness. Okay. I'll do a little bit of a plug, and this is not the purpose of this, but I will say I did an entire little mini webinar on this. If you follow me on Instagram, It's called How to Show Up for Someone Who's Grieving. And the purpose of it is to help people around you know how to best support you. So you can give that to them as a Christmas gift. Hey, I didn't spend any money on you. Here's a webinar that's free that I want you to listen to. Okay, so here's what I'll say. Grief does make people feel uncomfortable, and that's their problem. Can I say that, Kelly? Yes. That's their
Yes,
problem.
you can.
Here's the thing, right? There are a lot of things in our society that make other people uncomfortable, right? But at the end of the day, especially with regard to grief, it is about honoring the consequence of you not sharing your reality is suffering. Is suffering. Now, this doesn't mean you've got to walk around and hold up a banner, I'm grieving, right? But in those moments where those emotional responses are overwhelming you, or you are perhaps being triggered, it's okay to name the reality and take those steps to help yourself. Will that person perhaps feel uncomfortable? Maybe. And that's their problem. And I'm not saying that to be mean. I think that we've got to help people get comfortable being uncomfortable. And in that, what they're going to discover too is that they have some of the same questions, concerns, and worries that you have. And that, again, there's a universal thread. So focus on what it is you need in the moment and then honor that accordingly.
Awesome. Great. Our next question says, my fear in feeling my grief is that if I let myself feel it, my whole day will be consumed with sadness and I won't be able to show up and complete my duties as an employee and a parent. Any advice?
Yes. Oh my goodness. Okay. So this is exactly where I was at the end of 2012. And that's part of the reason I put those track shoes on. I was like, if I even let a tear get under the eyeball, it's just going to be a flood and I'm never going to be able to function. And that's a true reality. I do think that we have to always balance the truth of continuing to live in the present while honoring a loss that we've experienced in the past. So one of the ways that I do this is not saying this is the only way, but I give myself permission to grieve, right? Throughout the week, I have certain times, and it's only for 10 to 20 minutes. So this is not, I'm going to have a whole day of crying or a whole day of anger, right? But I do provide a space to give myself permission to feel whatever I'm feeling. And I specifically have connected it to grief. So this isn't 10 minutes of just simple check-in. This is 10 minutes of, hey, as I think about my mom, as I think about my dad, as I think about other losses I've experienced, what's coming up for me? And I set a timer. And the purpose of that is to remind myself that I do have to continue living, right? I do have to take steps throughout the rest of the day. At the same time, I don't want to ignore and compartmentalize, because you already know we get busy and then our grief gets pushed further and further and further into the recesses of our heart. And that's where the internal suffering can start. So get creative about when you might be able to embed that time. And also know that this is going to require some trial and error, right? So it may not be the middle of the day for you as it is for me. It may be before bed. It may be top of the day. So sort of play around. But I will say that on the heels of that exercise, have some people in place that you've already shared. Hey, I may need to call you if I notice a floodgate or I have to go back and do this. Let them know that this is something you built in so that you can get the support on the back end.
Yes, it's such a tough balance. And I think exactly what you said, trial and error, of course, like so many things in life.
Absolutely.
Okay. Our next question says, what are your thoughts on the phrase, I think you paraphrased this phrase in your talk, you are only as sick as your secrets. I have struggled with wanting to be authentic, but having a lot of fear for leading me to use disordered coping skills. I don't want to hold the grief, anger, and sadness within me. I want to let go, but my default setting is to fall into toxic patterns. How have you healed your secrets and received wellness?
Yeah, that's such a great question. This could be 5 hours. Whoever asked that, you're going to get bonus points for the question. So the truth is, like, we all have a default status, right? And I'll be honest, mine is doing. Being busy is a way that I naturally, because both of my parents were in the military, that's sort of the way I'm wired, is to do and to keep going and to sort of ignore. And this is not to down military families, but in my military family, that's what it was. So busyness is my default. So I am actually reading a book. I forgot the name of the book, but one of the concepts that they talk about is whatever your default status is, to actively and intentionally do the opposite. Now that I know that I'm I'm a doer, worker bee, right? One of the things that I'm intentional about is rest. And I schedule it. I literally put in my calendar, I'm not saying all day, but like 20 minutes or so, 10 minutes to just rest. I might put my head on the desk, throw in a classical music and listen to that, or take a nap, but it's the opposite of what I would normally do. And part of this is retraining our brain, right? Trauma, as you all probably know, sort of positions us neurologically, neurobiologically to rewire our response mechanisms. And that default becomes hardwired. But the good thing, right, about our brains is that they are malleable, which means they can change. And so part of it is you actively, intentionally retraining that to do something different. So make a list of what your natural defaults are, and then almost sort of create an ideal sort of thing. Tell someone for accountability, right? And then work to sort of systematically, without judgment or shame or criticism, to do those opposite things. And over time, that will become more of a default than your natural default. Okay, I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, that's wonderful and practical that we can do right now. So that's great.
Mhm.
So our last question is, where's the line between resilience and coping? How do you know which state you're in after a lifetime of repressing and escaping through busyness?
Oh my gosh, you guys, these are great questions. Okay, so resilience and coping. All right, so I'm going to answer this by throwing out another concept, and that's this whole idea of post-traumatic growth. Okay. When I think of resilience, which the sort of the basic definition of that is sort of the bounce back that we have in the face of some overwhelming event. I don't know if I want to bounce back, right? Resilience, bouncing back to, is sort of implies, I've done this thing, I'm going back to, but we're constantly and ever evolving, right? We're never really going back to who we were, because even 5 minutes ago, I was different than I am now. And through life experiences and different choices and environment, we're constantly growing. Post-traumatic growth is an acknowledgement, it's sort of holding up these two anchors, which is, yes, the trauma's happened, and that will be part of my story. It's not who I am. And I think that sometimes with resilience, there's an identification, sometimes an over identification with the story that keeps people stuck. So post-traumatic growth is sort of honoring, hey, yes, I've gone through that. That may be part of my narrative. Yet here are opportunities where I have been able to grow and expand and establish meaning in the face of my loss or trauma. So it is a tricky balance, but I think it's important for you individually to sort of sit down and think about what comes up for you when you think about resilience. That's what helped me shift away from that and more into more of a post-traumatic growth mindset, and sort of keeping stock on, it's not about always growing, but it's also not all about just staying in a place where I'm telling a trauma narrative, right? I've got to sort of flex between these two so that I can honor both simultaneously.
Yeah, I think that makes so much sense. And then while we're doing that, having self-compassion along the way, and whatever stage you're in right now, maybe you're telling the traumatic part of that story right now because that's how you're feeling.
Yep.
But knowing that you will progress and it will get to a space where you feel that post-traumatic
Yes.
growth.
Can I throw in a little nugget here?
Of
So
course.
I'll sit with folks and they'll sometimes ask, well, how do I know if I'm like stuck, right, in quotes, in the story?
Mhm.
And one of the things that I think is always important, I had to do this for myself, but I also challenge people to do it, is to assess the motivation for the story, right? We have probably all been in a season where you were telling your lost story and the motivation of it maybe was to be seen which is normal, or to be validated or to feel like you were known in some way. Nothing's wrong with that. There's also the motivation of inspiring, right? So sort of lead yourself and lead others towards something different. And so if you're noticing that as you tell the story, that the motivation is all about you, that may mean that it's time to sort of solicit some new coping mechanisms, right? Because it's not all about you. As I mentioned before, as you grow and expand, you're not only impacting and helping yourself, you're impacting everything and everyone around you. So assess that motivation, and that'll help guide you to sort of know if you're in more of a post-traumatic growth space, or you may be at a stuck point. So I hope that
Awesome.
helps.
That's the perfect place to wrap it up for today. So thank
Okay.
you, thank you so much,
Yeah, you're welcome.
Mekel, for being here today and for your heart and your experience. And thank you to those who make this series possible. And most importantly, thank you to all of our viewers today who showed up, held space, and brought forward the amazing questions that we got answered today. We truly are stronger together. Next Monday, we'll be here, same time, same place, with our speaker, Annie McCullough, and she'll be talking about music in recovery. So thank you, everyone.